Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Dr. Jillian Spencer, a child and adolescent psychiatrist from Brisbane, Australia. In April 2023, she was stood down and later suspended from the Queensland Children's Hospital for raising concerns about the harms of gender interventions for minors. She remained suspended 3 years later. She has brought a legal case against her employer, claiming she was subject to political discrimination for being directed to affirm children's claimed gender identities against her belief that people cannot change sex. This case will start on 2 November and will be heard for 2 weeks. Dr. Spencer was recently assaulted by security officers at a conference for holding a sign in support of her colleague who had his medical license restricted and his College of Psychiatrists membership suspended for 3 social media posts on gender. I welcome Jillian Spencer to Savage Minds. I can't believe we're speaking now after Friday's decision.
Yes.
I was disgusted and at the same time not surprised, given the current era in which we live. As I said during lockdown to people who were becoming more and more surprised by the pseudoscience around that nightmare, I said, well, we were set up for this. Don't you understand that governments across the West have been working to ideologically train people to understand that men are women, that lesbians have dicks? So I take umbrage at what happened for all of you in Australia. At the same time, I think it's a red light for people who've been sitting on the sidelines to start writing their political leaders, local representatives, national as well. Not just there, because you are facing similar issues to what Canadians are facing. And it's time for people to understand that this is not just a feminist issue. I would even argue that the feminist issue is probably tertiary. There's a lot here about ideological control and forcing people, including you in your profession, to undo the Enlightenment. If we could start off with your having spoken about initially accepting the standard gender-affirming narratives before noting clinical details that did not add up. So your journey to where you are today wasn't because you're a petulant obstructionist to anything you're told. What specific patient presentations or clinical patterns first prompted you to question the prevailing gender-affirming model?
Yeah, so being a child and adolescent psychiatrist, during training, there's an enormous focus on developmental stages in childhood. And every model of child development that we studied in training spoke about identity formation during adolescence, going all the way up to young adulthood as people figure out their preferences in life, their relationships, what sort of activities and work they want to do. Child psychiatrists generally are really proud of that developmental approach, and they're almost snobby because they see adult psychiatrists often as being a bit more simplistic, taking things just as a slice rather than looking at the whole picture. Yeah, so being a child and adolescent psychiatrist, it used to be that we were quite snobby, feeling that we were so holistic and family focused. You know, we'd do our 3 generational genograms to understand the dynamics. And then, strangely enough, we just had this movement come through our profession, which asked us to ignore all our training, ignore the developmental stages of childhood and adolescence. And we were mandated to see children presenting with gender distress as naturally trans and gender diverse, or any distress that they're experiencing as due to the stress of being trans in a cis heteronormative world, with the idea that gender transition would relieve the distress and connecting them to the queer community would also improve their mental well-being. So I guess in terms of patient presentations, I saw a whole range of kids presenting with gender distress and getting affirmed. There were the kids with developmental disorders like autism. There were the girls who had an eating disorder who also reported gender distress, claiming to be the opposite sex. And then a whole lot of very traumatized and troubled teenage girls who had a recurrent, history of recurrent self-harm, suicidality, emotional regulation problems, who then reported that they were trans and were seen at the gender clinic and affirmed. So we were sitting around in groups of, because in clinical meetings, you have a team meeting where you talk about each case under your care to make sure that there's multidisciplinary input. And we were sitting there referring to these children as the opposite sex. And in no way was their gender distress considered something related to their other mental health conditions or issues. And we weren't in any way seeing gender distress as something that we'd focus on for treatment.
And in your training, did you study the history of the development of the DSM? For instance, how what is called today gender dysphoria has been rebranded constantly?
Well, we looked at the history of the DSM. So it was always understood that it's a manual that's, out of the American Psychiatric Association, and essentially groups of experts in a particular diagnosis would get together and decide on the criteria. And I think there's other conditions within psychiatry that perhaps are more, the diagnostically more underpinned by research, but clearly, obviously, with the gender diagnoses, it's the gender-affirming clinicians that would be considered experts, and they would be highly influential over what is the criteria for the condition.
I'm curious about this because one of the things that struck me when I initially got involved in publishing about this movement, in highlighting the debates between feminists and the genderologists, as I will call them, was the genesis of how the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders evolved. Because in the second version of this in 1968, this was listed under transvestitism, under sexual deviations with no distinct category for gender identity, but later morphed in the DSM-3 1980, where transsexualism was introduced and gender identity disorder of childhood as a formal diagnosis, framing cross-gender identification as a disorder requiring clinical treatment. Skip to 1987, the DSM-3R refined the criteria and added gender identity disorder of adolescence and adulthood, non-transsexual type. Then the DSM-4 in 1995 consolidated all of the above under a single category called gender identity disorder, GID, which defines strong cross-gender identification plus persistent discomfort with one's biological sex. And then, the latest of 2013, the DSM-5, which replaced this term of gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria. And there's a later addition in 2022, the DSM-5-TR. It's a minor text revision, but it retained gender dysphoria as the diagnostic category. Between this, the WHO, where transsexualism was removed from mental disorders in the ICD-11 in 2019, replaced by gender incongruence. Then, of course, WPATH, which I've written much about. It's a lobby. I'm so sorry. Anyone calling this, it's like, I think of the Flintstone Lodge and their grand poobahs. That's what it is. So it's the Flintstone Lodge of people who, I'm sorry, but I watched this all unfold in New York in the early 1990s, including friends of mine, one who was rather recruited. And I get very concerned to see what is a clear fabrication through pseudoscientific language of a condition that is not past the muster of peer review, scientific study, nothing. And this is why I find what's happened to you so egregiously dangerous. And yet, is anyone in the room who've been disciplining you, have any of them read? Really? Because it's very clear when you look through just the history of the DSM that this was a highly stylized ideology leaning upon the blah, blah, blah of science, in quotes. I ask all the transgender activists when they claim it's real, their condition is real. I think it's funny, isn't it? Your condition is so real, but it manifests in one way. Now, two, but primarily it's about vestiture, Now, the new front since 2013 has been to force women to see you as you see yourself, which is insane. It's taken on both haute couture and then go to political ideology. And that is not medical. There's nothing medical about it, except that there's been a very clear tailoring to rely upon the language of medicine so that you doctors are hijacked into this narrative. And you have little hope of surviving it, especially it seems from what I've read of your case is that you were not a senior doctor. You had a lot riding for your future career and you suffered for this.
Yeah, it's been extraordinary. And when you asked me about whether the people around me had studied the history of the DSM, etc., I guess there's really, academically clever people in psychiatry, but you can't account for the willful blindness that has happened. And my understanding of that is that it's not a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of wanting to see because of human tribal dynamics. What I saw at the hospital was a reaction to fear. I've come to see that because when this happens to you in the beginning, it's this incredible experience of rejection from all your colleagues. And naturally, you wonder what it is about you or what have you done wrong. And it took me a long time going through it to realize that it's actually nothing to do with me. There's no metric of character or ability that I'm falling short on, although, I have my faults, but it's not that. It's that I represent something feared, which is that I am doing something which means that if people, listen to what I say, then it threatens their institution, which is the institution that clothes and feeds them. So, I tell you, in the beginning, it's super hard because you're not aware of this. And so you keep reflecting on yourself. And then what I particularly found amongst colleagues is that they have all these defenses that, are to my disadvantage. So in the beginning, they would pick on something that I did and suggest that that was, where I went wrong. If only I hadn't done that little thing, then they would have been able to be supportive of me. Or, yeah, it's been fascinating to watch the way that people deal with hearing information that threatens their job and career and causes them to, have to face conflict with colleagues, which no one wants. I noticed that, there's quite a bit online about this being the result of feminisation of the workforce. And I don't mind thinking about that concept, like I'm open to all ideas. But in my hospital, we were female dominated in the lower levels, but it was male dominated in the management and executive levels. And so, yes, there were assertive women who, were engaged with, affiliated with the gender clinic and assertively implementing this ideology. But there was a lot of weakness and following the rules by men in the organisation, senior men. I'd be interested in what your thoughts are, Jillian, but I was so naive back in 2023 because I'd been watching these senior men in meetings, being outspoken, being super clever, impressive. Like I enjoy watching clever people discuss aspects of a case or, that's part of the enjoyment of the job. And I honestly thought that these senior men would get together and sort the issue out of the gender clinic and help me. But, no. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
I have to say, Jillian, that I find this all very depressing and frustrating. I had to step away from writing about it constantly several years ago, especially lockdown took over. I think we are dealing with cognitive dissonance. Hand in hand with this, we have another situation of surrogacy and what the feminists would call the subordination of women or the enslavement of women to their bodies. It would be very difficult to disagree with them on that front. But isn't it funny? I mean, really funny that no one's going to these trans women for babies? Now, they know that sex is real. So I find this all very insulting to our intelligence, aside from the fact that if you were on Twitter in 2012 about this discussion, 2013, you'd get lectured at by a lot of these activists saying, well, that's your born identity, but my lived reality. And this is where the left has a lot to account for, or liberal arts left has a lot to account for, because there is such a thing as reality. And this is all about the neoliberalization of medicine. So you asked me what I thought. I mean, my thoughts are quite critical about a movement which I deem quite fascistic in origin. They believe that they're breaking the gender binary, but anyone can see they're reinforcing gender stereotypes. They're saying, I'm a man who likes baking cookies and Laura Ashley. That makes you a man who likes baking cookies and wearing frocks. That does not make you anything else. And how did we come to this is largely the result of neoliberal, both social and economic policies. So what you're talking about with mostly women at the lower ranks, I would say when you start to look into a lot of the structures of these NGOs like GLAAD and all these pro-gay, pro-LGB, now adding the T and all the other letters, these organizations are largely, at least in North America, driven by women. And so women have a huge hand in this, maybe not in the psychiatric community per se, because psychiatry, different from psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and psychology, probably has more men than women at certain levels. Still, I find this very distressing that on the one hand, we're being told by various governments, you better adhere to this. I just read an article today about how the UK police is having 30 arrests a day about social media posts, etc. I'm sure some based on this issue. At the same time, we're being told we're a democracy. And it's like, no. These do not go together at all. And you are proof to this because you've now been 3 years without your position. And you pointed to the problems and you're being forced into claiming the standard of gender affirming narratives as gold. Could you talk a bit about what the primary risks of bypassing or condensing comprehensive mental health assessments in favor of fast tracking children into gender clinics are? Because I think this is one of the things that might have gotten you sidelined here, because you're pointing to something that the organizations that are supposed to be protecting patients, once they got rid of you, they didn't have to answer to that anymore.
Yeah, that's right. And I think actually, I wrote a journal article which ended up being published in the Journal of Controversial Ideas because nowhere else would have it. But what I was trying to point out is about the historical politicization of psychiatry. There's numerous examples of it. And that one of the things that I read while researching that was that a lot of phenomena, things that happen in our society, things that governments choose to do, they have a stated objective, but then really there might be another one, obviously. So say, for example, colonization, maybe they had a stated objective of, civilizing people, but really an economic objective underlying. And I think there has been a widespread acceptance of the superficial idea that this is about kindness and expression, and people have been suffering and need to be able to, be their authentic selves. People can really get into that idea. It was underpinned by obviously the Be Kind movement in women, and then in Australia, I'm not sure whether elsewhere, but we had a big movement of concern about bullying, with media concerned about deaths of young people from bullying. So, in Australia, we got very concerned about children being supported and made to feel good. But what's been unveiled in recent months in Australia, where worldwide this is unraveling, but in Australia, the institutions that are wedded to the gender affirming care are doubling down, and they're becoming very brutal. And in that context, some of the facade is crumbling a bit. For example, recently I went to the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists Congress, and in the keynote presentation, without interrupting the speaker, without obstructing anyone, I silently held up a sign which was in support of my colleague who's been kicked out of the college because he's been penalised by the medical board quite harshly for 3 social media posts on the topic of gender. And I was violently pulled to the ground and then dragged downstairs for about 10 to 15 metres for holding this sign. And the reason I was told by the CEO of the college that I couldn't hold the sign was he told me that it was advertising. And I think he knew, and I knew that I wasn't advertising. I had nothing to sell. It was about questioning a decision of the college. But what I'm finding, for example, in relation to that incident, is that the college is using all the usual language. So in their media statements, they're claiming that what I did was not respectful, or it could have been harassing or intimidating. Clearly, it's not that. I'm just getting all the usual language about kindness and respect and how they have to look after the safety of everyone. And it's really confusing because the college has been to outrun its shameful history of, abuse of power, and constant communication from the college is all about being least restrictive and worrying about justice, violence against women. It's compassion. They're all the themes, but when it comes down to the reality of someone questioning their choices, particularly when they've got financial and institutional investment in gender affirming care, then all of the brutality comes out. So I guess what I'm getting at is that there's sinister financial and career motives.
You've noticed that a significant portion of young people presenting with gender dysphoria may otherwise grow up to be same sex attracted. Can you elaborate on why you believe the current model might be altering the natural trajectory of these children?
Yeah, it's definitely an issue where children with gender nonconformity are more likely to later on be same sex attracted. And the interesting element I find is that it is not just adults identifying as trans that work in the gender clinics. Often there are gay and lesbian clinicians working in gender clinics. And it's intriguing to think about why someone works in a gender clinic. And of course, we can never fully know, but whether there is some sense of discomfort with sexuality that's influencing working in a gender clinic. I guess from my experience of talking to people in this situation, it just feels like that some adults had a strong sense of being gay or lesbian as a young person, and that's something that never changed for them. And then they relate that sense of certainty about that side of themselves, or the consistency of that, to the idea of gender distress, and think, well, that's going to be just as consistent as my sexuality was, where clearly that's not similar. So there's that. That's a fairly benign explanation of why nonconformity that could lead to same-sex attraction is being medicalised. I think there's a lot of I believe that, in a sense, people in minorities often get the sense that there's safety in numbers. I think there is a delight in having children follow a similar path, and a broadening of the proportion of people in society identifying as queer or trans is a good feeling for some adults. It's been a really confusing thing. We actually wrote an article on it trying to understand the reason for such rigidity in the environment, in that, the rainbow flags, the pronoun badges, the rainbow lanyards. It's so controlling of the patient, so that the patient can't actually express any doubts and the parents can't express any doubts. There's a whole lot of mechanisms to make sure that no one doubts or feels upset about about their gender distress, that it can only be viewed positively. And that's very unlike any other area of child and adolescent psychiatry, which is, on the whole, quite depressing, in that, you see kids with going through terrible situations and trauma, and they're miserable, and you try and help, but you never feel heroic, where the gender affirming model seems to create this setting where the clinician controls the environment and controls the patient and their family so that they can only hear positives. And that is sort of like a narcissistic reward in some ways to try and shape the patient and their families to see you as someone who's the great healer who's done the right thing.
You said something earlier about the evolution of this. And I think the way the patient is treated as this kind of sacred person to uphold is part of the problem. And it's interesting because as you were speaking, I kept thinking of various books I've read as an anthropologist about the sacred and the profane. And these subjects have been turned into sacred objects. You cannot question them. You cannot question the discourse that props them up. And this is insane because as someone who comes from the formerly named LGB community, I'll never forget in the mid-1990s, I was working at GMHC in New York. I was doing research on the changing AIDS demographics for them with a group of other researchers. Crixivan came on the market and everything shifted. All of a sudden, all these gay and lesbian organizations that had heretofore worked on helping mostly men, gay men, get through their last days on earth, help their partners keep their housing, and various other themes like this, I witnessed these organizations shifting mandate. And this is something that I think needs to be taken up into law because what we're watching, and this is where the critics of feminism say you only have yourselves to blame, are not wrong. Because feminism has largely pivoted on this, we are the biggest victim in the room. And it's not a great political strategy when you have other people studying your dance moves and saying, oh, we're going to take that from them. That's what's gone on here. So now you have these groups that are both saying we're the biggest victims in the room, which again is a very anti-intellectual way to approach this. This should not be about victimhood. This should not be, as you just stated, about putting forth an ideology through medicine and not being allowed to question it, not being allowed to even ask for evidence. Because as I have told people on the show a few times, even when interviewing them for articles, have you ever had a patient come to you and say, I think I'm a man or I think I'm a woman, and the clinician say, really? Okay, you want to be a man? My car's outside, fix it, right? Or you want to be a woman? I need someone to clean up here in the office. I'm going to underpay you. We're going back to, again, the stereotypes that they pick and choose. And it's a narrative that's been picked and chosen for them as well. Everyone likes to go back to the mid 20th century and that infamous war hero who went and became a woman and this other one and this other one. And it's like we're looking at a Guinness Book of World Records of what exactly? Because this is proof of social contagion when you start to look at recent years. But this is not proof that people are born in the wrong body, because I think that was addressed during the medieval period, right? Are people born in the wrong soul? Are people born in the wrong body? So I ask you how you approach the intersection of what is called neurodiversity in your field, such as autism spectrum disorders, and then complex psychological trauma with this sudden onset gender distress in adolescence that people like Lisa Littman not only noted, but similar to you, she was also punished for her work on this. There is nothing scientific about repressing obvious remarks that point out even more obvious manifestations that are linked to the social or psychological trauma that have absolutely nothing to do with a sick gender identity.
Yeah, well, I think it is very normal to have identity exploration in adolescence, and then there are particular kids who are going to struggle with it much more than others. We've always known that, and they're the kids with developmental problems or a history of, attachment difficulties or trauma. And what we rely on for those kids is, trying to make the environment as safe as possible so that they can, explore their identity and take more time to grow up and understand themselves and understand the world. So the real problem is the environment prematurely foreclosing for these children on an identity that they claim is certain. And what we know in child psychiatry is that often certainty is a defense against uncertainty. So, it used to be that any child that had a wall of certainty about something, we were always like, well, that's probably an area that they're, can't think about right now because it's too anxiety provoking, it's defense. But yeah, all that knowledge went out the window. But I guess when you're talking about the LGBT community and the time of the AIDS epidemic, etc., it strikes me as that, I don't know, but that must have been a time of quite external action and gaining pride and a sense of purpose and community from actual practical acts of service towards other people, which is wonderful. But my experience, maybe I'm not sure of our age difference, but maybe I'm just a couple of years behind you, but was that after that, the LGBT movement, when I was a young woman, there was this much more focus, and maybe it was because we were young and it's part of an adolescent mindset, but it was all about, are you this, are you that, are you vegan, are you wearing leather shoes? There's a whole lot of controlling behavior around, are you a woman who's appealing to men and wearing lipstick or not? All that sort of individualized policing. It seemed to, because is it right to say that the community that you had as a young woman was much less focused on the individual identity as a way to, I guess, attract people or to be deemed acceptable?
You are not alone in this, but are there others who are saying we need to demand government intervention through serious studies on this? Because as I always say to people, I'm sorry, but I find this really wild how, these men who claim to be women have their archetypes. Will it be Doris Day? Will it be Brigitte Bardot? Will it be Jane Fonda? Will it be Miriam Makeba? Isn't it ironic that the reference to woman is always within their culture? They're not like going out and becoming Maggie Cheung, or they're not going, it's always a reference to their own culture, at least linguistic icons. So I'm very skeptical about this altogether because what we've seen is a discourse that is eating itself. They claim to break gender binaries, but they're creating them. They claim to be revolutionizing gender. If you call mid-1950s housewife staying at home and men telling women to shut the fuck up, as you and your colleagues have been politely told, but not just by men, this is about intellectual conformity.
Yes. We've got, sorry. Oh, in Australia, we've become so captured that even the National Health and Medical Research Council, that's looking to review the guidelines on gender interventions for children, has been stacked with gender activists, including the lead researcher for the Royal Children's Hospital Gender Service, which is the service in Melbourne that set this all up in Australia and seeded the affirmation model around Australia. So they put the most people who are most advocating of gender-affirming care on this supposedly independent research committee that's developing these guidelines. So they're not scared to breach the trust of the Australian community by having this organisation produce guidelines that are due out on puberty blockers mid-2026 and then 2028 for the whole guideline. But they're not really scared of breaking trust with the Australian community by doing things like stacking panels. And actually, just to back on the topic of tribalism, I feel like it's an asymmetrical fight with the gender activists, because what they do have on their side is the blind loyalty of the tribe. And I do think that potentially what gender transition offers to young people is, forming part of a club. And if you've gone to the extent of, being a young woman who's grown a beard and cut off her breasts in order to be part of the club, then the loyalty is blind. But the problem is that what I've noticed on our side is that there isn't that blind loyalty. And originally, I had quite strongly felt that all that matters is to be surrounded by people of integrity. But recently, with my colleague, Dr. Andrew Amos, having his medical license severely restricted for these 3 social media posts, the stakes got a whole lot higher, where every doctor in Australia who was aware of it, was in stunned silence, shocked and frightened. And then in the context of that, trying to get people to sign an open letter was incredibly hard. And I found myself, really sad about some of the people that told me that they wouldn't sign, people that I would never have believed wouldn't sign. And I guess what I'm getting at is that, goodness, what is life like if no one has blind loyalty and love so that they will take a risk to help you? If we only have academic integrity or self-preservation, then it's a very sad world. So I can see why the queer community and that sort of tribalism has an attractiveness to it.
In a world market where jobs are fewer and fewer, and you and I both know much of our adult life, most of our adult life is spent in and around work. We are working at work. We work at home on work. We socialize often with people from work. This is our identity. Now we're looking at a world job market that is in steep decline, and young people don't have that to tether themselves to pass their hours with. And I think there's partly that to address. And I think sociologists should be studying that for sure. At the same time, as you rightly point out, there's a cachet to having an identity that's built on being the sacred cow. And I think this is a very dangerous thing to do to people, not just young people. I think it's a very dangerous thing to do to our societies, because these people no longer are held to account as subjects in their own right. And our entire society runs around with these platitudes. You've heard them. They're the most mindless platitudes I've ever heard in my life. Ours is just to confirm their identity. I don't want to hurt your feelings. It's all about no hurt feelings. It's about going against your own cognition, because again, no one is running to these transgender women for babies, for surrogacy. None. In fact, when that happens, please drop me a line. I'd love to know. I'd love to know about that. It's just not happening. What we're seeing is what some of the feminists would say, the pornification of some of these men, which is, okay, I've had Ray Blanchard on the show, and he's talked a lot about autogynephilia, which of course has become greater in statistical measure since society has changed towards the former closeted homosexual community, which is no more or very few. Now, this raises other questions, however. You're dealing with children, and of course, many people see what's happening with adults as being a kind of slippery slope to showing children what can be done. What does your evaluation of the current and available medical literature say regarding the claims that medical interventions like puberty blockers are life-saving and that they drastically reduce these risks of suicide?
Oh, yes. Well, I think it's been conclusively proven now that puberty blockers don't reduce the risk of suicide. There's studies related to looking at suicide risk for children that are affirmed and compared them to the general community and children accessing mental health services. And the suicidal risk, it's low in all children, luckily, but the suicide risk that is there is accounted for by mental health conditions. And I think with the live experiment in the UK where they've stopped the prescription of puberty blockers and there hasn't been an increase in suicides, thankfully, I think it's pretty conclusive that suicide myth was a myth.
Yes, well, even though it's been proven, it's also been proven that lesbians don't have penises, but they continue. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. The truth doesn't matter. Yeah, and that's why I think this is a political movement. And as you rightly say, all the special language assigned at birth and all the special colours and flags and lanyards, it's all just to identify people that aren't complying. And then the other major clue that it's a political movement is that when we do get these studies through, like the most recent study out of Finland, which is such high quality and shows increased specialist mental health service utilisation in children under 23 who have been transitioned, it just doesn't make any difference. The gender clinics just keep going with the affirmation model. The governments keep tying their brand to making these services available to children. So if this was some sort of health intervention, then the changing evidence would trigger changes in clinical practice. But no, it doesn't. So, yeah, it's incredible.
Also, the fact of this medical transformation of the body to meet the psychiatric disorder. Of course, people who agree with this ideology, how dare you call it a disorder? Yet, what about the Scottish doctor who was suspended for chopping off limbs because someone said, my arm ends here. Can you take the rest off? There is no light between the two arguments. Yet, bizarrely, because if I was going to suspend, you had this kind of game show and you have to suspend one of the two doctors, the doctor sterilizing children and removing breasts, or the doctor removing parts of limbs, I would probably choose the former and not the latter. Yet that doctor has been used. I did it years ago when I started investigating this. I was like, why was he suspended? And amputating healthy parts from children's bodies and young adult bodies is okay. The difference is the ideology of one has been shuttled into outer space. We are seeing it everywhere. And so you as a practitioner are dealing with codes of conduct, medical ethics, yet you've been suspended for pointing out that there's a lack of ethics all around this. And so I ask you, following your suspension from clinical duties at the Queensland Children's Hospital in April 2023, how has the hospital administration's stance on this issue evolved regarding the code of conduct allegations leveled against you?
Yeah, it's been an interesting road for the last 3 years, and I've never had any disciplinary problems ever before. So I really didn't know what happens when you're perceived to be naughty at work, but now I really know the process. What happened to me was that I got stood down, and it was on the basis of a patient complaint that's been unsubstantiated by the hospital. And I won't say more about it because I'm told that I'm not meant to, but it's been unsubstantiated. And also I attended the Let Women Speak rallies in Australia, and I spoke anonymously. I didn't reveal my employer or my qualifications, but still they tacked that on as a reason to stand me down. And in that context, back in 2023, there was very little media on anything to do with gender interventions for kids. It was complete silence, and I was, frightened. I got told that I would lose my medical registration, and someone told me that the only way to try and protect myself is to go public, with the strategy of having the public's eyes on you can sometimes keep you safer, where if you remain in silence, then they can do what they want to you without anyone knowing, and it's more dangerous. So, so unfortunately, I had to make a pretty serious decision. And so I did go public with what was happening to me. And then in speaking out to the media, raising concerns about gender interventions, that is what's caused my employer to keep sending me what are called show cause notices, which are essentially saying that making allegations that I've breached the code of conduct. I've had 4 show cause notices, each with multiple allegations. In Australia, you're not allowed to disparage your health service or criticise colleagues. That's against the code of conduct for the public service. And it doesn't matter in the slightest if you're talking about a medical scandal and trying to protect children, you're still not allowed to do that. And so on paper, the hospital is the one that's the adjudicator of whether I'm right or wrong. And so the hospital has substantiated allegations against me where they believe I've breached the code of conduct. Now, they've even said that I've breached the code of conduct when I've talked just generally about gender clinics or gender clinic doctors. So they're saying, well, that's because it may include the Queensland Children's Hospital Gender Clinic or Queensland Children's Hospital staff. So what I've found out through this process is that even as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, speaking anonymously, it's a breach of the code of conduct. Even talking generally about gender clinics, it's a breach of the code of conduct. So there was no way I was going to be able to speak up publicly without facing, incredible risk to my employment. And so that's what I continue to face. In September, they sent me a termination notice, which is one of the final steps. But luckily, my lawyers have appealed for a judicial review of that on the grounds that my employer didn't adequately consider my human right to freedom of political expression and implied right to freedom of expression under the Constitution. So that's still ongoing. But it's been a hell of a ride. But what can one do when one is dealing with a medical scandal? Like, it never goes well. I've had a lot of time to look into the stories of medical whistleblowers, and it just never goes well. So it's like I think of it as a psychological extreme sport. You quickly lose most of your colleagues, and then you slowly lose the rest of them. But yeah, luckily for family sticking by, and I've had to do a lot of yoga to just come to peace with it, accept it. Like I think I was the angriest woman in Australia for 2023 and some of 2024, and I just had to do a lot of yoga to settle down my sympathetic nervous system. I was getting easily teary and obviously feeling angry a lot, and it's just not helpful. So I'm doing all right now. It's at the moment, the issues with the hospital are just awaiting developments. But what I'm dealing with at the moment is the medical regulator in Australia, because I'm being investigated for social media posts myself. So that's the focus at the moment. So yeah, it doesn't stop, unfortunately. The sort of persecution just keeps.
You're being investigated for social media posts now? Yes,
because I've been posting in support of my colleague, Dr. Andrew Amos, who, as I mentioned, so you can't.
I followed his case.
It's a crazy situation where once someone gets done over by the medical board, all that person's colleagues are expected to just remain silent and abandon them, and I just won't do that. I had that, and I won't do it.
You're listening to Savage Minds. If you're enjoying the show, take a second to subscribe at savageminds.co. Feel free to comment below or drop us a line to share your thoughts. Support independent media today. Now, let's get back to it. And across Australia, children are studying the history of Galileo. I mean, this is the irony. Mm-hmm. Everything's easy to see the repression historically, but not in the current era. You have described the hospital environment as increasingly hostile towards dissenting professional opinions, like your colleague. What specific mechanism within the medical hierarchy make it difficult for doctors to voice safeguarding concerns? Aside from what you just mentioned, which I did not know, that you cannot even criticize the structures. This is extremely dangerous and dystopian.
Yes. Yeah, well, I guess on reflection, I was really naive, and I didn't, for some reason, there's other people in the medical system who are more aware of the restrictions and more cautious about speaking up. And so most of them seem to have an innate sense of fear about that, and they don't do it. I have been looking into other medical scandals, and so that's how I have come to realize that other people are more cautious on these fronts than I am. So what are the structures causing it? Well, it seems to be within people to know not to challenge their institution. And then there's the threat of HR setting in, which always frightens people. There's the threat of the medical board. But what I faced in the hospital was inappropriate workplaces behaviours where the gender clinic worked in concert with allies to the gender clinic to essentially let everyone know that I was undergoing disciplinary procedures for saying that I didn't want to use the preferred pronouns of children. So it was a warning to everyone else, don't support her and don't do what she did. There was leaking of that information that I was being disciplined for that purpose. which was useful in frightening colleagues. But just on the topic of schools, I think that what's going on in schools is, in Australia, that with the respect for relationships curriculum, is the teaching of kids really young, not just about gender ideology, but they're really deliberately imposing words, making them learn these words like transphobia. And I guess they do talk about other words that are very powerful, like racism and homophobia, misogyny. But the reason why I think these words are being taught, though, is that they're actually weapons, and children, and especially teenagers, are socially, anxious and caring a lot about their reputation and status within the adolescent group. And so if you teach kids that these are weapons that you can pull out when you're discussing a topic, then it really does teach people not to speak up, because there's no way you can defend against a character attack if I can't really prove when someone calls me transphobic. It's hard to defend against that. I can obviously talk about how my primary concern is the protection of children, but I think for the schools, they're really teaching kids how to shut down other children using those sorts of words. And then there's also strong socio-emotional wellbeing curriculum, which teaches kids to be preoccupied with their feelings and to view anyone that says something they don't like as that person being disrespectful. I don't know what it's like overseas, but in Australia, it's extraordinary how many signs we have around within shops or public transport facilities, even at the local gym. Every time you call a call centre, there's a message about respect and how disrespect will not be tolerated. Is that the same overseas? Because in Australia, what's happening is this concept of respect has become so broad that it is actually telling people that they can't think outside the paradigm in terms of just having spontaneous and enjoyable conversations, using jokes, allowing the just natural connection that occurs between humans, which can be at its best a little bit rough and tumble and surprising, sort of eliminating all that, and such that communication is meant to be wholly sanitized to be supportive and boring.
You're not allowed to be funny anymore. See, illegal, not right. I understand why comedians left their own stages at a certain point. You had a lot of comedians saying, I'm not going on tour these last years. And I don't blame them, because it would have been a punishment for them. When we think about Galileo, we think about what's happened to you and your colleagues, and there will be more. You've had an unblemished professional record of over 20 years with the Queensland Health Hospital prior to 2023. So you've had to take solace in yoga, all your studies, your career. I mean, what personal and professional impact has this formal stand down had on you?
Oh, well, it's been frightening. The main problem is it's been having to deal with fear, which has been really interesting, because I keep saying to myself, well, they can't take your kids off you and they can't take your physical health. What are you scared of? Lots of people have to retrain in the middle of their life into a different job. Lots of people, lose their career and have to face that. But I have wondered, and this could not be true, but I have wondered whether there's something particular about essentially scapegoating someone, being the scapegoat, that is psychologically very difficult to deal with, that isn't explained just by the facts of the matter. And I think that could be true, because I noticed that even people at the hospital who were on the verge of retirement with massive nest eggs weren't willing to speak up, even though they wholeheartedly agreed with me. And I do see it in colleagues too, people that are not willing to speak up who, are in a position to do so. So, so it's been how to manage the fear. And I must say, I really feel like it's been helpful for my own emotional development, in that I reckon I've gotten a lot better than I was at dealing with strong emotions. But it has had an impact. I don't think I'll ever be the same person that I was. Yeah, it's sort of hard to explain, but the weirdest thing is that it has been strangers who have come to me, and in some ways, like I am in debt to some people who have done stuff for me that is above and beyond. So you sort of have to, oh gosh, I sort of, in trying to deal with this, I have come to this idea of, we're like molecules of water in a river and we flow together sometimes, but there's no, you start coming up with ideas about trying to explain how to come to terms with how you can't, rely on your colleagues in the long run, but you do for the day. But then other people will come through if you need them, and hopefully you get what you need. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a work in progress, but I'm in a better place than I was, thank goodness. And I don't think I'll get back there to being so distressed like I was in 2023.
Would you have support among some of your colleagues that even if they might be too afraid to speak out, they privately support you?
Yeah, well, I do have emotional support, particularly. I think I've got somehow I ended up with the most emotionally supportive husband that I think no, no one else could have a more emotionally supportive husband than me. And then I've also got my sister, and I've got other people. I don't really, yeah, that's the thing when bad things happen, like this assault at the Congress, people will offer to meet for coffee, and that's appreciated. But sometimes what I need from colleagues is action in terms of them writing letters or trying to find a way to really make a change. And I think that's the difficult thing. Not everyone has a political mind. And so, in fact, perhaps particularly in psychiatry, not many people do. So they don't necessarily sort of think of ways to further the cause.
There's also a problem that we see in the Sal Grover case as well, which I find vexing. The fact that the man taking her to court received complete public support. He didn't have to raise millions for his lawyer. Wait, what? These are conflicting interests where the human rights group helping him should have also dedicated equal amount of funds to her. I'm sorry. If they really believe that they're doing the work of human rights, it seems that Australia's failed the public, because here you have conflicting human rights and that agency is giving funds only to one half. This raises also similar issues that maybe feminism and feminists must start to discuss. We've been covering this on the show in terms of something I went through, domestic violence in same-sex couples, where you are not seeing the authorities respond appropriately, because I've been stalked for the past 2 years consistently. And the police recently said, maybe she just misses you. They would not say that had my assailant been a man. And there's more. There's many lacunae also in terms of public policy, how victims are framed. Of course, the victim's only ever a woman, right? Cannot be someone else. I think we're at a point in our very postmodern world, if I can call it that, where we're seeing conflicts between policy, politics, public engagement, medical ethics. In fact, in your case, I would say, Jillian, that I would regard you as a whistleblower. Yet paradoxically, you are not being treated as a whistleblower. Medical ethics typically require a professional in your situation the obligation to raise alarms when danger is perceived. You did it. So how do you respond to the administrative argument that your actions constituted a breach of staff conduct rather than a protected act of whistleblowing?
Yeah, well, I have gone down the whistleblowing pathway formally, and in Queensland, is the problem is that it's your employing institution that gets to decide whether you're a whistleblower or not. And so I had formal meetings with my bosses in 2022 where I talked about the harm to children from gender interventions, and specifically mentioned infertility, lack of sexual function, long-term physical health problems, and the risk of regret. And I also talked about a culture within the hospital of cheerleading troubled, confused children down this pathway. And so when in 2023, my lawyers on my behalf told the hospital that they wanted that disclosure to be treated as a public interest disclosure, which is what we call our Whistleblowing Act here, the hospital decided that I hadn't blown the whistle because what I'd said wasn't serious or specific enough. So they thought that infertility, lack of sexual function, and long-term physical health problems, etc., wasn't serious or specific enough, and that it wasn't dangerous because there was a multidisciplinary team, which we all know is everyone in that multidisciplinary team is paid to take an affirming approach. So they came up with this excuse to say why it wasn't a public interest disclosure. And then there's an internal within the hospital appeal process, which I went through 2 times. And of course, those new assessors who were employed by the hospital came to the same decision that it wasn't a disclosure. And so now we've taken it externally to the Queensland Industrial Relations Commission, and all submissions about that went in by May 2024. So I'm up to 2 years waiting for a decision from that commission as to whether I'm a whistleblower. And that would, in theory, be helpful in that if I am found to be a whistleblower, then if the hospital doesn't act on the danger that you disclose within 6 months, you've got the right to talk to a journalist. And obviously I'm accused of breaching the code of conduct by talking to the media. So it would be helpful, but all these proceedings to do with my employment are going ahead whilst I'm still awaiting this court 2 years later for a whistleblower decision. And I suspect, much like Sal Grover's court obviously was captured by gender ideology, probably mine could be too. And maybe that's why I'm not getting the protection of the court in that way. I don't know. But these systems that have been, like in Queensland, the Public Interest Disclosure Act was set up after this massive Fitzgerald inquiry into police corruption, and it acknowledged that in that environment, to be a whistleblower, you had to be, either a fool or reckless. They wanted to set up a system to make it safe for people working in public entities to disclose dangers. And that system hasn't helped me yet. Our institutions are failing us in Australia.
Yes. And it's alarming when I see lesbian groups in Australia. We know of the case in Tasmania, but there's another one ongoing. The issue is stark. You're trying to tell lesbians that men are lesbians. Therefore, this is not just gay conversion therapy. One could make the legal argument this is state rape, right? I mean, what the hell? This is insane. I'm sorry. I'll start to curse in a moment, and I'm trying not to. This subject and lockdown are my big cursing events. What fresh hell is this? Where the government has any right to prescribe language and thought. This is what this comes down to. You're not only allowed not to say it, you're not allowed to think it. And this is where Australians should be out in the streets protesting this. I don't care if your partner is identifying as transgender. This is a danger to civil society. It's a danger to freedom. God, I feel like a Republican saying that.
Yeah, sorry. No, that's okay. Unfortunately, in Australia, it's people are quite disengaged, and I feel like a lot of people don't really know about the issues that are going on. They're busy having barbecues on the weekend, and I'm glad that they're having a good life in that way. But it is, I think, getting very dangerous because of that. And also, the other issue is that there's such a fragmented media. I don't know that, I think there's a proportion of the population that maybe is focusing on entertainment, Netflix, etc., in their spare time rather than looking at the news. Obviously, the news is there's a whole range of sources, but the mainstream news outlets still don't cover these issues with any objectivity. And so we're relying on what people perceive to be right-wing news sources to report our stories. And then there's a whole group with the tribalism people on the left who will just dismiss outright anything that those media outlets say. So it's very hard to reach people regarding these issues?
I've given lectures around the world on my work, and my last lectures before the pandemic were on this issue in Brighton, even in the Middle East. One of the events where I spoke, I had a group of people being very sympathetic, shocked also, and they were, oh my, I can't believe this. I went to reach out to one of them quite recently, and I noticed that their social media was covered in this, that they've been sucked up into the Borg. And I just thought, oh my God, the last time I saw her, she was expressing not only complete agreement with what I was saying, but horror for what was happening. And I find this a sign of the times, truly, because when you can allow yourself to blindly knee jerk into any kind of movement, ideology, team, what have you, without thinking of the consequences. And this is where we are. And I don't think it's helping the fact that today people are struggling around the world. The professional class is being jobbed out. IT is being replaced by AI more and more. So we're seeing the rise in financial crises. People are having to work more jobs, more hours. They're, as you point out, many people are just chilling out when they get home. They're not even doing like what our parents did in the 80s, watching TV when they get home. They're just going straight to Netflix and watching a zombie apocalypse film because it's the least close to their reality. I understand this, but it's all deflective. We can all sympathize with someone who doesn't feel good in their body. Goodness knows this goes along with other psychiatric disorders, anorexia, bulimia. There are people who go through great lengths to come to terms with their bodies and who never do. That said, have you seen the role of community and family within the current system, particularly regarding cases where parents are cut out of the medical decisions or feel pressured by the threat of losing custody in these divorce situations that I'm sure you're aware of? And then you have the community at hand as well that's pushing one way or the other, depending on their point of view. How is this understood within the psychiatric community? Because if anything, this itself speaks to ideology and not medical viability.
Yeah, I think what we have in Australia is there's people that are gender affirming clinicians who are super enthusiastic and they set themselves up for that purpose, and then the children with gender distress get funneled their way, because anyone who's not wholeheartedly in support of the gender affirming model just steers clear of seeing these children and providing treatment. A lot of my colleagues have told me that they just don't accept referrals from kids with gender distress. And I think it was last year we had a family court case called Re Devon, where there was a male child where the mother was wanting to transition the child and the father was wanting to be cautious. And that father said under oath that he'd contacted, I think I've got this right, but hundreds of different psychologists or counsellors for children in Melbourne to try and find a more exploratory approach for his child. So not a gender affirming approach, and he couldn't find someone. So it's just a handful of health professionals across Australia who are what we call gender critical, wanting to take an exploratory approach and willing to see these kids, because it's such a precarious position. And I know, this handful of people, and every one of us have had problems with our regulation body, for example, with the psychology bodies or with APRA or with the Human Rights Commission. It's a disaster, actually, what's going on, in that it's just so dangerous to take an open-minded approach.
Well, an open-minded approach, and what you learned in medical school and what you learn around medical ethics, as I mentioned just earlier. There's a real danger now to all medical professionals. If you're not allowed to report things that you deem unethical, then what hope is there for your profession?
Yeah, it's just not what I expected things to be. I was in the hospital, and generally with medicine, there was so much what I now see as marketing, but what I at the time believed all about speaking up for safety and patient care, integrity, doing the right thing, the hospital values, the hospital vision statement. My goodness, I believed all of that to be true, that they even actually now on the hospital website, they talk about how they regard whistleblowers as exemplary organisational citizens who are important in pointing out, wrongdoing within the institution. Like they've got a whole spiel about supporting whistleblowers. But so this is why, across Australia, we've got, I think, 6 gender clinics, or at least many that are affiliated with major tertiary children's hospitals. And I know that those people, particularly the child psychiatrists and the paediatricians who are the clinical leaders within those hospitals where there's a co-located gender clinic, they're all surrounded by, mandatory training and signs and vision statements about first do no harm and speaking up for patient safety, reporting harms. But, there's across Australia of those doctors, there would be hundreds working in that environment, seeing the harm and then keeping quiet about it because they know that it's just not safe. Their jobs on the line, their medical registrations on the line, they'll lose all their colleagues if they speak up. So it's an incredible level of suppression that has been achieved by this movement. And, it's really the institutions that are wielding this power over us.
I'm just thinking through all the things you've told me now, and it seems that the system is set up to not be questioned, to have no resistance in any way, not just around this issue. I've got to wonder about other medical issues. We know about, let's say, the debates around something like Lyme disease, and that has become politicized. I wrote an article years ago about another thing that I'm afraid to talk about, but I got more hate mails than I did for my gender pieces. I was in Islington one day working on a draft of this article on the gender wars. I had a book on the table. Next to me, a woman looked over and says, "Oh, I love that book." And it was a book pertinent to my research. And she asked about what I was doing. And I told her about the first article I had just run a few months before. And I had just come back to London after having to go to the Middle East for protection. And I told her about this article that I published and the death threats and the rape threats that I, my daughter, and my publisher had. And she says, "That's really wild because I work in a similar problem area." And I said, "Really?" And she says, "Oh, yeah, you should look up chronic fatigue syndrome." This woman started to tell me how she was a psychiatrist and was working with the current head of the Royal College of Medicine, who I later met up with and interviewed. He still, to this day, has to have his mail x-rayed. He has had numerous death threats over this situation where he was advocating for GET therapy for CSF. And oh my gosh, his story put into perspective the larger problem here, because I think it's really important that people keep in mind this is not about misogyny. It's not about making cyborgs out of children. This is not about any one thing except conformism and genuflecting to structures, that there is no more room to question these structures. Where skip back to the 1980s and how many films were being made about those soldiers who testified about the rapes that U.S. soldiers committed in Vietnam, and Oliver Stone made films of this nature. No more. Those days are gone. Being a whistleblower is also become problematized since the Obama administration started to criminalize journalism. He was most definitely guilty of this, and many people in that party refused to accept the horrors that this person inflicted. But this became also a template where saying the truth, now you might be a whistleblower and you might be Edward Snowden, you might be in a prison. Aside from the fact that you have personal support, which is, of course, useful, it's also good to have collegial support, because I'm sure you have days where you might even wonder if you made the right choice, because you're seeing all these other people saving their skins. Why not you?
Yeah, it is confusing, but I think what it comes down to is oh gosh, it's this weird thing where I know the other side talks about being their authentic self, but there's something about me where I do have to most of the time be honest about what I'm thinking. I find it much harder to sort of censor. And when I go to these, psychiatrist conferences and other circles, which I know in some commentaries, they're talking about sort of elite people, but it is like a strange way of talking where they want to sort of be overly positive about everything and everyone. They don't want to acknowledge problems, and they want to talk in a way which is it is creamy and sanitized, and I just don't think I can do it. So so in some ways I can't do what they're asking me to do. I can't just keep quiet and sell my soul for my job and watch children getting harmed. I just can't do it. I don't really feel like I've got much of a choice. I don't know why other people do have a choice, or I accept that they do because people are different in their nature. But I guess it's this strange thing where I go around looking for people who are able to be honest with me, but also able to be caring in the sense of that they're not wholly just, some people are sort of cold, and in some ways, you can't get any connection with them, but you do appreciate their integrity because they're wholly honest. So like Goldilocks, I go around looking for people who can be honest and upfront about what they're thinking, even when they know it won't suit me, but also have the capacity for human connection and care. And I wonder whether there's people across the world who are out there doing the same thing as me, just looking to find these people, because it's the sort of, maybe it's a bit dramatic, but the last vestige of humanity before we all go under.
Yeah, I can totally see that, especially since I witnessed when I started researching my pieces in 2012 and 13, then I started to see some very disturbing, nefarious writing on the wall, where I saw the youth transitioning being pushed by middle-aged men. And I'm thinking, what's in it for them? Well, what's in it for them is a Monday morning affirmation for them. So people can say, we got it wrong for so many years, Bob. They're looking for a kind of affirmation from them using a surrogate's children. I found that very disturbing. And then on the other hand, what's disturbing intellectually is that the Cass Review in the UK fundamentally altered the approach to youth gender medicine by recommending against routine puberty blockers. Yet Australia has not followed this path. Why do you believe Australian health authorities and gender clinics have been so slow or resistant to adopting similar caution?
Oh, goodness, the Cass Review, that was extraordinary. I'd been waiting for that, because I got stood down in April 2023, and it came out it was a year later that the Cass Review came out. And I heard ahead of time by word of mouth that it was going to be supportive of the position I'd taken, and all my hopes were riding on the Cass Review. And when it came out, it was, a heavenly experience. Like, oh my goodness, I thought all my problems would be solved when that came out in 2024. And then gradually on the radio and in the media, I saw national broadcaster, the ABC, getting so-called experts to say that the Cass Review has no relevance to Australia, that we have an entirely different model. So yes, it's nothing to be seen here, which is incredibly untrue. Like, we have the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, gender service went to the Tavistock and got that model and brought it to Melbourne and then seeded it around Australia. So, and so gradually, I think that was one of the hardest times when I slowly realised that Cass Review was going to do nothing here. And I think it is the problem is that the governments, in state governments across Australia, apart from in Queensland where we have a centre-right government, it is these left-wing governments across Australia and federally that have tied their brand to this political movement. They've been so supportive of transitioning children. They still are. They still go to the various marches, and they still put things on social media for Ida Hobbit Day, etc., and various events promoting that. There's so much government funding going to LGBTIQA plus lobby groups in Australia. And what we see when these institutions figure out that they're part of a medical scandal, they don't change course. They just double down. And so that's what we're seeing in Australia. We're seeing all the institutions double down, and it's gotten so dangerous in 2026. And at the start of this year, I had people saying to me, "Oh, look, it's all unraveling overseas. I think the ball's rolling down the hill, and you could just keep quiet, and it will all, work out by itself." And at the start of 2026, I was feeling, like I had a bit of peace, and then it's just all intensified. Obviously, what happened to Dr. Andrew Amos was a terrible shock, and then all the fallout from that. And then obviously Sal Grover's decision. Yeah, in Australia, things have just gotten a whole lot worse in 2026 for us. And I have to say that you have the most marginalised, psychologically marginalised people in the Australian community. I don't know that you're familiar with that term, but that's what the LGBTIQA plus community say, that they're the most vulnerable and marginalised in the community. But I have to say that people speaking out against gender medicine are, marginalised.
It's boring for me, honestly, as a woman, as someone who is gay. I'm tired of the oppression Olympics. I don't want to hear it anymore. I've just been through hell in my personal life. And when I hear women talk about male violence, well, I'm working on a piece called Female Violence. No, violence is not male or female, it's human. And I think we need to start to address it. I think these identity labels that feminists once excelled in now have been copy pasted into the gender movement. We need to abandon this and deal with realpolitik, because I see it here all the time in Italy. The people suffering the burden of lockdown are not specifically one class, except for the poor and working classes. And if you want social housing anywhere within social democracies, you have a better chance of getting it if you're a woman, and even better chance if you're a woman with children. So yes, the people on the bottom rung of the social ladder are going to be men. And no one wants to discuss this. Let's not discuss this. But I think it's really important that we start to talk frankly and stop this tick boxing of oppression that has led us where we are. Because, well, I mentioned WPATH earlier, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Now, this was an outgrowth of previous institutions that are linked directly to the Johns Hopkins Gender Clinic that was shut down in 1979 because there was a failure to demonstrate that it did anything, okay? They shut down because they saw that they were just a hamster in a wheel doing pretty much nothing. But those practitioners were jobless, and they decided to go out and make something for themselves. And here we are. And I think it's important that we sort of look into what WPATH's role was and what has happened to you. Because as you well know, a lot of the medical institutions across the West will finger point to their guidelines, to what they suggest. What is your assessment of WPATH?
Oh, well, it's an activist organisation masquerading as a health organisation. I think what happened was that I know a lot about the OzPath, which is the Australian version of WPATH, but I think they've all followed a similar trajectory in that they started off as a group of essentially doctors who were fringe and passionate about this issue. And then as time went on, they started to count lived experience as equal to clinical skills. And so then they had to admit as for full membership adults who have lived experience of trans. And then that has changed the organisation so that it's just become a political organisation. But it continues to have the ear of government and the ear of health services because it's pretending to be a medical organisation, the peak body. And then in Australia particularly, we find that it's the people working within gender clinics who seem to be the experts in this area because that's where all the kids are funneled towards. And so they have seen the most kids with gender distress. And so if you do anything like have a review panel without the so-called experts, which are the gender clinic doctors or people with lived experience, then you're perceived to have not done a thorough review and understanding of the issue. So it just is the way that they put in activists into medical decision-making models.
Well, it grew out of the Harry Benjamin Institute, I believe it was called, which was attached to the clinicians from the Johns Hopkins Gender Clinic. And they've done a few name changes over time. It used to be called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association as well. You mentioned it at the very beginning of our talk about people making their livelihoods from this, so they're not going to question it. And this is part of the problem as well, where I'm very much in favor that all NGOs have a shelf life, that you are not allowed to have an NGO for more than X number of years, 4 or 5, without a review. Maybe they should be treated like presidential terms, because I've seen this even in the development industry. These NGOs claiming to go and help and feed and clothe children. No, these were machineries for elite graduates of universities from elite families to have a job, but they get to mark a nice line on their CV, but they do very little for the people on the ground. You see this in Italy all the time. All these organizations, especially around Christmas, they want your money, but it's about keeping their lights on and their titles. You don't really see things happening to the very communities they claim to represent. Get a few photos that break even UN regulations around photographing children. But this is what I see as part of the problem. It's a capitalist problem of providing emergency relief or services or recognition of. And at the end of the day, there is no serious professional discussion happening at all. And we know this because I'm sure you're aware of how this whole movement was born in terms of the Reimer twins. And that is insane. I would like to see a psychiatric organization, even a panel, and a book produced from that panel about the very wrong-minded idea that a child who is victim to a botched circumcision should ever be the cause célèbre for gender identity. This is insane. Both he and his twin brother killed themselves due to the abuse they suffered at the hands of this doctor, John Money. So I'm wondering, in terms of the professional accountability that you are holding, your colleagues are not, how do you see this going? Because obviously, CAS review has had no effect in Australia. But if you were tasked with redesigning the framework for youth mental health services in Australia, how would you restructure them? And how would you structure the intake treatment of children experiencing what they call distress over their gender identity?
Yeah, well, that would be very easy in Australia because we have a network of child and adolescent mental health services across Australia, which have good skills in understanding that children have a presenting complaint and exploring that presenting complaint, trying to understand all the linkages between their development and their cognition, their psychology, their family relationships, their past history, and how that relates to what they're going through. So those skills are present in these mainstream child and youth mental health services or child and adolescent mental health services, depending on what state you're in. So all we need in Australia is for all of our paediatric gender clinics to be shut down and for the government to decide that no minor should have access to puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. Obviously, someone like me that's cautious would love it to be not just 18, but a bit higher before people could access, irreversible interventions that change their life forever with serious health complications. But I don't think any government in Australia would do anything. 18 is the best we can hope for. So, yeah, all we need is the gender clinics shut down and for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to not be prescribed. And then I guess there is the conversion therapy legislation, which exists in a lot of states in Australia, which is a barrier because, as I mentioned before, the health practitioners working in the community are too scared to do exploratory therapy. So we'd need that to be repealed. But it could be done. It could be done quite easily. But it would mean that there's a whole lot of organisations that would have to redeploy those staff and, I guess, acknowledge that the reason that they're redeploying those staff and losing government contracts and money is because they did something that was harmful to children, and that is not something that I've seen any institution come to grips with. Have you seen that anywhere in the world? Institutions themselves coming to admit that this is a medical scandal?
Medical scandal, no. But I have to say, I've spoken to so many people within the Tavistock, and even if the institution has not come forth per se, the plethora of whistleblowers says it for them.
Yes.
I think that is an absolute scandal, what happened. And I don't understand why the next step was not taken. That might be happening soon or not. Again, Britain, sometimes, it's a cultural thing, but maybe let's just pretend this didn't happen and move on with our day. It depends. I do think that this should be done because the danger is outside of national boundaries. And again, the UK and the Cass review itself, I don't know if that would have happened had there not also been a complete reversal in other countries within Scandinavia and the Netherlands. So the knock-on effect is real. But what is the current status of your legal or administrative battle to be fully reinstated at Queensland Children's Hospital? And what precedent do you think your case sets for the independence of medical decision-making in Australia?
Yes, well, in terms of my employment, I'm just going through the legal processes about that. So that's yet to be decided. But what I have done is take a case against the hospital alleging that they've discriminated against me for my belief in biological reality that people can't change sex, and that imposing the gender affirmation model upon me, that was a politically driven decision on their part. It wasn't driven by any evidence or other reason. So that case gets heard on the 2nd of November, and it'll go for about 2 weeks. And it'll be useful because the gender clinic doctors will, they've obviously provided affidavits, and there's opportunities for cross-examination. So it's a way to shine a light on what was happening in the gender clinic and also what the hospital was doing to me. And then the judge will need to decide what the reason was that this was done to me. So I'm looking forward to that, day in court or 2 weeks in court, because I just want people to know that this has happened. It's been an extraordinary situation.
What advice do you have for other medical specialists, junior doctors, especially psychologists who harbor similar clinical concerns, but who fear the professional consequences of speaking out after seeing what has happened to you?
Yes, that's a very hard question, because what do they do? What do they do? I guess they have to join an organisation such as GenSpect, which exists in Australia, and work with the team of people to, do things like putting in submissions and meeting with ministers, writing letters. It's all that background work, that background pressure to try and make things change. I don't know what they can do within institutions. I find it fascinating because the challenge would be to be within an institution, speak up about a medical scandal, but not lose your job or your colleagues or your reputation or your career. And that is a challenge which I don't know how people do it. There's another guy, a colleague in a different state, who is trying to, but he's been trying for years now, doing it all the right way, and nothing has changed. So I don't know how other people thread that needle, but I'd like to see them try. I don't know that many people are trying, to be honest, but it's the ultimate psychological challenge for a psychiatrist to try that. And I'll be happy to compare notes about outcomes.
Yeah. I'm very sympathetic to what you've gone through.
Thank you.
I mean, I would still be angry. I don't know if yoga would be enough to contain my anger, because I'm sorry. I'd be like, oh, Shanti, motherfucker. I'd be so upset. I would be so upset. It's just because you spend your young years studying, sacrificing your social life so you can get those degrees so that you can do your love of your life of professions. And then you are barred from doing this due to fabulous notions around science. And no, I think this ultimately will go very well for you and your colleagues who know what reality is. When you're at one of these barbecues, do any of the people who know about what you've been through come up to you and secretly lend support and say encouraging words, even if they can't speak about it in their own lives?
Yes. Yeah. Are you talking about colleagues, psychiatrists, or just socially?
Even just socially, because you know the pressure
Yeah.
on people to conform and say, yes, you look
Yeah.
fetching.
Well, it's interesting because of my situation and having to try and defend myself by going public, I have pretty much taken every opportunity I can to be in public. It's not for self-aggrandizement, or like I'm not someone who naturally is that way inclined, but when one is under threat, one has to dig deep and find something. And so, yeah, I haven't declined an opportunity to engage with the media, but I just go about my ordinary life down at the supermarket and, various just normal activities. And it's not once, I've never been, no one has come up to me and said, oh, you're that woman who is going through that situation. So, yeah, I don't know how much cut through I have, probably not much. But it is the case that absolutely people who know about my situation, like I get a lot of messages on social media, through the various platforms, being supportive, and I'm, actually love responding to them. I don't ignore any of them because it's just so, welcome to connect with another person who understands and can see what I've been going through. So no, that's lovely. And that is very healing to know. And I'm not a religious person, but I do, there's people there who say I include you in my prayers, which, is very comforting. So, no, I value all of that. So it is because of what's happened to me with my colleagues and feeling so disconnected. These opportunities for connection are very valuable to me. And so, it's really important to look at, like I'm lucky in so many ways in my life. And this has just been an extraordinary experience that I will learn from and hopefully be able to contribute, when other people go through this. I guess, the one thing that I would hope for other whistleblowers is that they have one person who stands by them professionally. Makes a hell of a lot of difference. And, Dr. Andrew Amos has done that for me, and that's why I've been quite vocal in trying to support him while he's getting persecuted this year in the most egregious way. So that Australian mateship value is really important, turns out.
Well, if it's any consolation, I found this YouTube video last night late on my stream and I watched it. It's this American comedian. I think she's a lesbian. And she said, yeah, I was talking to a friend and she says, yeah, I'm not using they, them anymore. And she says, oh, yes, you are. And she's like holding them to account. She goes, all those years you had a gazillion different genders. You are going, and I laughed so hard because I think this should be their punishment, that they must have those pronoun badges until the day they drop dead. I'm sorry. But...
Well, yes. And that's the hilarious thing because, when I was at university as a young woman, I was really woke and, yes, I grew out of it, and I think that's part of what allowed me to recognise it maybe more earlier than my colleagues. But it's certainly something that you grow out of. Like it's an idea that you get tired of, and I'm looking forward to when everyone's just really sick of it and they can't stand it 1 second longer.